morning of March 7th, 1943, broke cold and grey over the forests west of Smolensk. A lingering winter chill gripped the land, frosting the trees and hardening the snow-covered fields. The air was still, the silence broken only by the distant, rhythmic chuffing of a steam locomotive struggling against the cold. At 4,000 feet, Senior Lieutenant Alexander Pokryshkin banked his Bell P-39 Airacobra through a layer of scattered cloud, the red stars on its wings stark against the dull aluminum skin. Below him, the world was a patchwork of white and deep green, and at its centre, like a black insect on a ribbon of steel, sat his target. He advanced the throttle of his Allison V-1710 engine, feeling the familiar nose, heavy acceleration push him back into his seat. The aircraft responded with a throaty roar, a sound that had become as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. The German supply train was motionless on the tracks, stranded. A plume of white steam vented rhythmically from the locomotive's piston valves into the frigid air, a sign of life. Tiny, dark figures, the crew, scrambled around the front trucks, working frantically with hammers and crowbars to clear ice from a frozen switching mechanism. They were exposed, vulnerable, and had just made a fatal error in stopping in the open. Pokryshkin's eyes, narrowed and calculating, scanned the terrain. No visible flak cars, no signs of immediate anti-aircraft defenses. It was a clean shot. He had flown American fighters before. The P-40 Warhawk with its brutish shark's mouth. The bulky P-47 Thunderbolt that Soviet pilots affectionately called the Samovar for its rotund fuselage. But the Airacobra was different. It was a creature of contradictions. The mid-mounted engine, placed directly behind the cockpit, created an unusual center of gravity that made the aircraft feel twitchy, alive in his hands. It was prone to tumbling into a deadly flat spin if mishandled during slow, speed maneuvering, a quirk that had killed more than one inexperienced pilot. American pilots had rejected it for the high-altitude fighter combat over Europe, where its performance degraded severely above 15,000 feet due to the lack of an effective turbo supercharger. But Alexander Pokryshkin was not flying at 15,000 feet. He was diving toward a stationary locomotive, and the weapon mounted in the nose of his aircraft, a 37mm 4 cannon firing through the propeller hub, was about to demonstrate why Soviet pilots had requested every Airacobra the Americans could spare. The question that would perplex German intelligence officers for months afterward was simple, almost plaintive. How had an aircraft the Luftwaffe openly mocked as obsolete and unsuitable for modern combat become one of the most feared ground attack platforms on the entire Eastern Front? The 37mm cannon represented the heaviest armament ever installed as standard equipment in a single-engine American fighter. Each high, explosive round weighed just over 1.5 pounds and contained enough explosive filler to penetrate light armor, demolish wooden structures, and, as German locomotive crews were discovering with terrifying regularity, punch catastrophic holes through the boilers, cylinders, and delicate mechanical assemblies of steam locomotives. The cannon fired at a relatively sedate rate of 140 rounds per minute, a slow, deliberate rhythm compared to the screaming, rapid fire machine guns that equipped most fighters. But what the M4 lacked in rate of fire, it compensated for with the sheer, sledgehammer destructive power of each individual shell. Pokryshkin lined up his approach with the methodical precision of an engineer, which, in many ways, he was. The locomotive grew larger, more detailed in his reflector gun sight. The fleeing crewmen were now just dark specks, disappearing into the tree line. Their desperate flight a confirmation of his intent. He took a final breath, held it for a second, and pressed the firing button on his control stick. The cannon announced its presence with a deep, resonant FTHEMP-THCMP, Teach MP that vibrated through the entire airframe, a sensation felt as much as heard. The recoil was substantial, a series of distinct shoves that momentarily jolted the aircraft's nose. The first round struck the boiler jacket, near the firebox with a flash of orange and a spray of metal fragments. The second and third rounds followed within a half-second, walking up the length of the locomotive as Pokryshkin made minute corrections. The fourth round found its mark perfectly, penetrating the boiler barrel itself. The result was instantaneous and violent. The boiler, designed to contain steam pressure of over 200 pounds per square inch, could not withstand the internal detonation of a 37 mm high explosive shell. It erupted. A jet of superheated steam, mixed with shattered metal, coal and water, exploded outward. The overpressure tore apart seams and rivets, peeling the boiler open like a tin can. The locomotive seemed to swell for a moment before disintegrating, its mechanical components, pistons, rods, and valves, scattering across the rail yard like shrapnel. A thick, white cloud of steam enveloped the wreckage, rising to meet him. Pokryshkin pulled up sharply, his wings slicing through the rising plume, the G-forces pressing him down into his seat. He banked steeply to observe the results. The train behind the destroyed locomotive sat intact, but utterly immobilized. Its cargo of ammunition, fuel, and reinforcements was now stranded 60 kilometers behind German lines, with the Springs Rasputitsa, the season of mud, approaching rapidly. This was not the air war the Luftwaffe had prepared to fight. This was a war of attrition, of logistics, of systemic destruction. And the P-39 Airacobra, the aircraft they had dismissed, was one of its most perfect instruments. The Bell P-39 Airacobra had entered United States Army Air Corps service in 1941, amid considerable optimism from its designers and deep skepticism from the pilots who would be required to fly it. The Bell Aircraft Corporation had created a radical, unconventional design. They placed the massive Allison V 1710 engine behind the pilot's cockpit, connecting it to the propeller through a long, slender drive shaft that passed beneath the pilot's feet. This unorthodox configuration was not merely an engineering exercise, it was the key to the aircraft's entire design philosophy. By moving the engine to the aircraft's center of mass, Bell's engineers believed they could create a more maneuverable, harmoniously balanced fighter. The space vacated in the nose was then occupied by the heavy 37mm M4 cannon, firing through the hollow propeller hub, supplemented by two synchronized 50 caliber machine guns. This heavy, centralized armament could be aimed with the simple point of the aircraft's nose, eliminating the complex convergence patterns of wing-mounted guns. On paper, and in early wind tunnel tests, it was a brilliant concept. The weight distribution promised superb aerobatic performance, and the firepower was unparalleled. Reality, however, proved more complicated. The Allison engine, without an effective high-altitude supercharger, lost power dramatically above 12,000 feet. At 15,000 feet, where the air combat over Western Europe was often decided, the P-39's performance degraded to levels that made it dangerously vulnerable. The German Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Fock, Wolf 190 maintained excellent performance well above 20,000 feet, allowing their pilots to dictate the terms of engagement, attacking from a position of altitude and speed advantage. American test pilots delivered harsh verdicts. The aircraft could not climb quickly enough to intercept high-altitude bomber formations. It could not maintain sufficient speed at altitude to catch fleeing enemy fighters. The unusual weight distribution, while beneficial in some regimes, created a dangerous and often unrecoverable flat spin if the pilot allowed his airspeed to decay during a tight turn. Several test pilots were killed during evaluation flights when their Airacobras tumbled into spins from which there was no recovery. The car, door-style side entry, while convenient on the ground, was a death trap in an emergency. The pilot had to jettison the heavy door before he could even attempt to bail out, adding critical seconds to an escape sequence that might be happening while the aircraft was inverted, on fire, or spinning uncontrollably. The British Royal Air Force, who received early production Airacobras through lease, flew exactly one operational sortie over France before declaring the type completely unsuitable for European combat. The aircraft was relegated to secondary duties and training units by mid-1942. American fighter squadrons destined for the European theatre were being equipped with P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs. The Airacobra had been tried, evaluated, and found wanting. Production continued largely because the factories were tooled for it, and because it performed adequately in other theatres, like the Pacific, where high-altitude performance was less critical. Luftwaffe intelligence officers who compiled reports on Allied aircraft capabilities noted the Airacobra's specifications with professional interest, but little alarm. Here was an American fighter that could not effectively contest airspace above 15,000 feet, could not escort heavy bombers, and possessed handling characteristics that made it a danger to its own pilots. Intelligence assessments circulated through Luftwaffe units characterized the P-39 as representative of a naive American design philosophy, adequate for colonial policing and ground support in primitive theaters, but fundamentally outclassed by modern European combat aircraft honed by years of high-intensity warfare. This comfortable dismissal would persist until Soviet pilots began demonstrating what the aircraft could accomplish when employed, according to its genuine strengths, rather than forced into a role for which it was fundamentally unsuited. The first Bell P-39 Airacobras arrived in the Soviet Union during the desperate winter of 1941-42, transported via the perilous Arctic convoy routes. They travelled in the freezing, damp holds of cargo ships running a gauntlet of German U-boats, surface raiders, and long-range bombers. Many never made it, sinking to the bottom of the Barents Sea, along with the tanks, trucks, and ammunition they were meant to deliver. Those that survived the journey were unloaded at the ports of Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, where Soviet pilots and ground crews examined them with a mixture of professional curiosity and deep skepticism. The aircraft looked alien. The sleek, tricycle gear silhouette bore no resemblance to the rugged, conventional lines of the Soviet Yakovlev Yak-1 and Yak-7, or the stout, radial engine Lavochkin Li-5. It seemed fragile, complicated. Its skin was smooth and tightly riveted, a contrast to the often rough, hewn finish of Soviet aircraft. The cockpit was a confusing array of instruments marked in English and calibrated in imperial units. Miles per hour, feet, inches of mercury. Soviet mechanics. Masters of improvisation who were accustomed to simple, robust systems that could be repaired with a hammer and a wrench in a frozen field, looked upon the P-39's complex electrical systems, its reduction gearbox, and its intricate plumbing with a sense of dread. The armament, however, commanded immediate respect. Soviet fighters typically carried a 20 mm cannon and a pair of 12.7 mm machine guns, effective against aircraft, but of limited use against hardened ground targets. The American 37 diamond cannon was a different class of weapon entirely. Soviet armourers quickly realized that this gun could destroy targets that laughed at smaller caliber weapons, locomotives, armoured half-tracks, artillery positions, and even the sides and rear of medium tanks. More importantly, Soviet tactical doctrine was fundamentally different from that of the West. For the Americans and British, air power meant strategic bombing and winning air superiority through fighter-on-fighter combat at high altitude. The Soviet Air Force, forged in the brutal, close-quarters meat grinder of the Eastern Front, had a different priority: direct support of the ground forces. The air war here was fought primarily below 10,000 feet, a swirling, chaotic melee over the trenches, where the primary mission was to kill enemy soldiers, destroy their tanks, and shatter their supply lines. In this environment, the Airacobra's crippling weakness at high altitude became irrelevant. Its strengths, the devastating 37mm cannon, its good low-altitude performance, its respectable speed below 10,000 feet, and the excellent visibility from its bubble canopy, suddenly became decisive advantages. The Americans had inadvertently created the perfect ground attack platform for the Eastern Front, even though their own doctrine had never envisioned it in that role. Alexander Ivanovich Pokryshkin was the perfect man to exploit this potential. He had joined the Soviet Air Force in the 1930s as a mechanic, working on engines and airframes before earning his pilot's wings through sheer determination and a brilliant technical mind. By 1943, he was a veteran of over 400 combat sorties, a survivor of the desperate battles of 1941 and 1942. He approached the Airacobra not as a pure fighter jock, but as an engineer. He studied its performance envelope, analyzing where it excelled and where it was vulnerable. The 37mm cannon fascinated him. He saw it not primarily as a weapon for downing other aircraft, though it could vaporize a German fighter with a single hit, but as a precision tool for the systematic dismantling of the German logistical backbone. Soviet intelligence had identified a critical German vulnerability, an overwhelming dependence on the railway system. The vast distances, the primitive road network, and the seasonal mud that rendered roads impassable for months each year meant that the Wehrmacht lived and died by the rails. Destroy the locomotives, and you starved entire divisions at the front. Their artillery would fall silent for lack of shells. Their tanks would become static pillboxes for want of fuel. Pokryshkin developed a specific, ruthlessly efficient tactic for attacking locomotives. He would approach at medium altitude, between 3,000 and 5,000 feet, where the P-39 maintained good speed and maneuverability while staying above the effective range of most light flak. A diving approach built up speed, making his aircraft a harder target for the German gunners, who manned the 20 Nemen and 37 enemy anti-aircraft cannons often mounted on flak cars within the trains. He would aim for the locomotive's boiler, the heart of the machine. A single 37 mm high, explosive round penetrating the boiler would create a catastrophic overpressure event, ripping the locomotive apart from the inside. The attack run was a matter of seconds: dive, aim, fire a short, controlled burst of 3 to 5 rounds, then pull up sharply and escape, leaving a wrecked locomotive and an immobilized train. Soviet aviation regiments equipped with Airacobras adopted these tactics and systematized them. This was not random opportunism, it was a coordinated campaign of interdiction. Intelligence officers maintained detailed maps of the German rail network. Partisans operating behind enemy lines provided priceless information on train schedules, routes, and cargoes. Pilots were given specific sectors to patrol and specific time windows when high-value targets were expected. The goal was to create a cascading logistical collapse, not just to blow up individual trains. The morning of March 7, 1943, was part of this larger campaign. Pokryshkin's regiment, the 16th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment, had been assigned to sever a critical railway sector. Their orders were simple: make the rails unusable. Force the Germans to rely on trucks that would soon be bogged down in the spring mud. Pokryshkin led the mission himself, taking off from a primitive dirt strip, little more than leveled ground with fuel bladders, hidden under camouflage nets. His flight of 4 Airacobras skimmed the treetops, using the terrain for cover, their engines a steady drone in the crisp morning air. The target was exactly where intelligence, said it would be a long freight train moving south. Pokryshkin signaled to his wingmen and began his attack. The same textbook dive he had perfected. The deep thump of the cannon, the walk of the tracers, and the final, cataclysmic eruption of the locomotive. It was a perfect kill. His wingman followed, destroying a second locomotive that had been coupled at the rear of the train for extra power. In less than a minute, a vital supply train had been transformed into a permanent, stationary obstacle. Initially, German intelligence viewed these attacks as a tactical nuisance. But by the spring of 1943, the reports from railway units became increasingly desperate and detailed. They spoke of Soviet fighters that destroyed locomotives with terrifying efficiency, with just a few cannon hits. This was not the pinprick damage of 20 Nemud cannon fire, this was total annihilation. Locomotives were not just damaged. They were obliterated, their boilers ruptured, their frames twisted into unrecognizable scrap. The arithmetic was simple and brutal. German railway troops could repair damaged track in hours or days, but they could not replace destroyed locomotives. There were not enough factories, not enough steel, not enough time. Luftwaffe intelligence was forced into an uncomfortable and embarrassing reassessment. Their previous reports on the P-39 were not wrong in their technical details, but they had been completely wrong in their operational conclusion. They had evaluated the Airacobra against the wrong criteria. It was indeed useless at high altitude, but the Soviet Air Force didn't fight at high altitude. They used it at low level, where its big cannon and adequate performance made it one of the most effective tank, busting, train, killing platforms in the world. German attempts to counter the threat were largely futile. They increased flak defenses on trains. But the Soviet diving attacks gave gunners mere seconds to react. They tried fighter patrols over key railway lines, but Soviet intelligence was too good, redirecting attacks to undefended sectors. They tried moving trains at night, but Soviet pilots adapted to the twilight hours. The vulnerability was fundamental. A locomotive was a huge, unarmored, unmaneuverable target that had to follow a predictable path. The cumulative effect of this systematic destruction was a slow, motion strangulation of the German war machine on the Eastern Front. By mid-1943, German commanders were filing formal complaints about crippling locomotive shortages. Supplies piled up at depots in Poland, while front-line units fought with dwindling stocks of ammunition and fuel. The destruction of a single locomotive by a pilot like Pokryshkin was a tactical event. The destruction of hundreds of them by entire regiments of Airacobras was a strategic victory. Alexander Pokryshkin would finish the war as one of the Soviet Union's top aces, with 59 confirmed aerial victories. But his true legacy, and the legacy of the Airacobra in Soviet service, was far greater than his personal tally. He had helped develop a doctrine that turned a rejected aircraft into a war-winning weapon. The United States would send over 4 700 P-39s to the Soviet Union, more than half of all Airacobras produced. Soviet pilots, while acknowledging its quirks and dangers, valued it for what it was, a superb low-altitude fighter, bomber with a knockout punch. The story of the P-39 Airacobra on the Eastern Front is a powerful lesson in the perils of doctrinal blindness. The Americans and British judged it a failure because it did not meet their specific, high-altitude requirements. The Germans dismissed it based on those same Western assessments. Only the Soviets, unburdened by these preconceptions and fighting a different kind of war, looked at the Airacobra and saw not what it couldn't do, but what it could. They saw the 37 dominant cannon and the sturdy airframe, and they built a devastatingly effective tactical campaign around it. The aircraft that was laughed out of the European theatre became a feared and respected hunter on the Eastern Front. Its distinctive thumping cannon, the sound of a logistical system, and an army being systematically taken apart.